Welcome to this basic introduction to the world of behavioural iridology. Before we begin, it's probably worth quantifying a little bit more about what we mean when we say behavioural iridology. One of the best ways to explain behavioural iridology is to look at its counterpart and supportive system, the physical model. The physical model of iridology has been around for something like 170 years now. This slide typically shows the model used to categorize the eye. Here we use the color of the eye as the base constitutional identifier. The blue or lymphatic type of iris, the hematogenic or dark brown type of iris, and finally, in between, the mixed category of iris. Having identified the base constitution, we then apply the various dispositions and diatheses over the top of this constitutional base to arrive at a more specific analysis of the iris. In addition to all of this, there are the iris maps. There are many versions of iris maps, and these all essentially map the human body onto the iris, the top of the iris representing the head, the bottom of the iris representing the feet, and so on. I've picked quite a lot of different iris maps here to show, because the interesting thing is that no matter which map you look at, a vast majority of the positions in them are similar. This is quite interesting in itself because it shows that there is a consistency in overall iris mapping. Having looked briefly at the physical model of iridology, now let's turn to the behavioural model and see how the two systems compare. When first approaching an iris and looking at it from a behavioural perspective, there are three important components that we look at. These are firstly, regular or straight iris fibre, open or loose weave iris fibre, and finally, pigment patches, or what used to be called sora. It could therefore be said determination of overall typing in the behavioural model is based on structure rather than the inherent iris colouring as we saw in the physical model, that is to say the blue, the brown and the mixed categories of iris. Having identified these three structural components, let's look at some real-world photographs of irises and see if we can determine these three types of iris structure. So for this example, we'll use a blue iris, primarily because it's easy to see the iris fibre very clearly. So where the arrow is positioned, we can see there's a dense grouping of iris fibre. Notice how it seems to flow from the centre outwards and looks fairly regular and straight. This is a good example of the first type of structure. Staying with a blue iris, our second example is that of the open or loose weave fibre. Here you can see there's a completely different feel to the eye. Although we can still see individual fibres, notice how many are parted or open, giving the appearance that we can see through to deeper layers in the iris. Lastly, we have the pigment patches. As you can see, there's quite a proliferation in this eye, and varying degrees of colour and position as well. So this is actually a nice example of pigment patches in an iris. So this concludes the three types of base structure that we're most interested in when making a behavioural judgment on the iris. Having established the three important types of structure, now let's look at the two basic constitutions in behavioural iridology. I found that this graphic has been quite useful to illustrate the whole system. And although at first glance it can look quite complicated, it's just a series of concentric circles. As we remove each circle, we can break it down into its component parts. There is also a secondary dynamic going on here, inasmuch as those traits which are represented by the outside of the circle are usually focused more on a general appraisal, but as we move towards the centre of the diagram, things become more specific. However, before we can get specific, we need to understand the generalities of the iris, and so we begin from the outside of the diagram and move inwards. Much like the three constitutional colours given in the physical model, here the behavioural model is broken down into two polarities. On the right of the screen, we have a blue semicircle which says feeling and emotional. On the left of the screen, we have a pale red semicircle with the words thinking analytical. These are the two primary polarities in this system. you'll note that there's an arm that extends from each semicircle and meets in the middle. This is to illustrate that at some point the two polarities almost touch. That is to say that you could look at an iris and try to categorize it into one or other of these two categories. It could be difficult to decide on which side of the line the constitution fell. They can literally be that close together. However, everyone must ultimately be one of these two polarities. To further aid us to decide which side of the line an individual will fall on, there are other tips and tricks that we can apply later on. But for now, it's important to know that these two need to almost touch to show that the differences between the two can be very small indeed. Now that we've established the two basic constitutional types are the feeling emotional type and the thinking analytical type, let's have a look at some real-world examples and see how we might identify these in the iris. Here are two good examples of the two different polarities. On the left of the screen, we have the emotional feeling type, and on the right of the screen, we have the thinking analytical type. So the question now becomes, how do we identify these two types? What exactly are we looking for? Let's start with the emotional feeling type. As previously discussed, we are looking for three types of structure in the eye: the straight regular iris fibers, rounded openings or wavy fiber, and finally pigment patches. When we look at the iris on the left, we can see it is composed of the open, rounded and wavy types of fiber. And while there are some areas in the eye that have a little bit of a pigment patch, for the most part this iris is composed of the aforementioned structure. It should also be kept in mind, I have tried to use images that very clearly show what I'm trying to illustrate, so this is a particularly good example of an emotional type. From the outset it is very easy to see this. This type of eye may not even need magnification to be able to see the structure, it's so prominent. In addition to this, it's also a blue eye, so there is very little surface pigment, and so the fibers are readily accessible in photography. Now let's take a look at the iris on the right, or the analytical thinking type. We notice straight away that the iris fiber in this iris is much more regular, and while there is some wavy quality to the fiber, we can see overall that it's much straighter. It's quite difficult to see through to the deeper areas of the iris. What really sets this iris apart is its proliferation of pigment patches. These are quite clearly seen, and like our first example, you'd probably be able to see these without the aid of photography in natural lighting. It is the combination of these tightly woven and compacted fibers, along with the pigment patches, that give us the thinking analytical type.